All right, we'll say good morning. We're going to begin by thanking our sponsors. I thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, the Elbaum family, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of their beloved husband and father, Jerry Yaakov Couple ben Avram Menachem Zichron Livracha. To thank Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the Shurim and Drashos this month in memory of her husband Avi, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi, on the occasion of his 9th yahrzeit. Our week of learning sponsors, Moshe and Ann Ellen Gevant, in memory of Ann Ellen's mother, Nechama Bas Shalom Yitzchak, and Larry Safnis, in memory of his beloved wife, Tanya Yona Bas Yaakov. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsor for this morning, Rachel and Jeremy Lassen, in honor of Josh Rosenblum's Hebrew birthday. Mazel Tov. And of course, and now, interesting fact, Josh's favorite food is Buxer. Incredible. Mamish. Wow, birthday, incredible. I will say, by the way, part of sponsorships, feel free to include personal information about people. It's a great way for us to get to know each other. Incredible. So we thank, first of all, Josh, happy birthday. Beautiful. Beautiful. By the way, I always say, Daf Yomi is a wonderful birthday gift, the anniversary gift, special occasions. It's the gift that keeps on giving. All right, Tavos says, so with that, we thank all of our sponsors. All of the Neshama should have an aliyah, and all of those having a birthday, Mir Hashem, should have a successful, beautiful, and meaningful year. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful daf ahead of us today, a lot to do today. Today's daf is Samech 68. So we are picking up, I will say, on Samech Zayin Amud Beis 67b, and we're picking up at the period. Amar Mar. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. So I will say, I just want to point out, so now we're in the middle of the sugya. Well, we're in the middle of a couple of sugyas, but right now in the middle of the sugya of Shiluach. So here's what we know. We know that halacha l'maisa, when you are tamei, you are sent out of the camp. What we also know is not all forms of tumah are the same, and therefore, again, not all forms of what we'll call expulsion. We'll call it's a strong word, but I'll use that word, expulsion or quarantine, are going to be the same either. We've already begun to see this in yesterday's daf, that different forms of tumah carry really with them different levels of quarantine or expulsion. So let's continue on that. Amar Mar, Zav v'chol zav l'rabos balkeri. So we'll say the pasuk says kol zav. So kol zav comes to include a balkeri. So remember again, whereas a zav is a man who has an emission, it's not a seminal emission. It's some other type of emission. But the balkari, of course, is a man who experiences a seminal emission. Such an individual is tamei and has a din of expulsion. Mechilos lo niskatshu ubalkari mishtaleach chutz l'shtei machanos. So we actually have seen this. We saw this at the end of last Daf Yomi cycle, Maseches Midos. In other Midos, there were tunnels. There was a tunnel system underneath the Beis HaMikdash. Those tunnels, interestingly enough, did not possess Beis HaMikdash sanctity. This was important because if you had a balkari, if you had a Kohen who became a balkari, how do you get him out of the Beis HaMikdash without him having to walk through the Beis HaMikdash? So they actually would get him out through a subterranean tunnel system. And the good news was that the tunnel system did not have Kedushas HaMikdash, and the balkari is sent out of Shtei Machanos. So remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, the 3 Machanos we discussed was Machane Shechina, Machane Levia, Machane Yisrael, modeled after the encampment in the deserts. In the desert, of course, it's much clearer. Machane Shechina, reference to the Mishkan. Machane Levia, the area surrounding the camp, the Levitic camp surrounding the Mishkan. Machane Yisrael, everyone else. In looking in Yerushalayim, for example, Machane Shechina would be the area within the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. Machane Levia is the Harabayis, and Machane Yisrael is Yerushalayim. All right, so so the Gemara says, so Balkari Mishtaleach chutz l'shtei machanos. Meisvei, Balkari k'magasheret. So we'll say, we bring another brayso, that a Balkari has the same status as a person who touches a sheretz, a rodent. Says the Gemara, my lav l'machanosam, does that not mean for expulsion purposes? The Gemara says, lo l'tumasam, no, it means for tumah purposes. Tumah purposes. So the Gemara says, L'tumasam, how can you say that they are equated for Tumah? That's not true. Hai Tumas Erev Ksivbei, I'm sorry, L'tumasam, Hai Tumas Erev Ksivbei, Hai Tumas Erev Ksivbei. See, I will say, I don't need to compare Balkari to Sheretz for Tumah, because Tumah is written explicitly by both of them, right? Essentially, Tumas Keri has a one-day Tumah. You become tar by the evening. And Tumas Sheretz has a one-day Tumah as well. Ela lav l'machanosam. Rather, it must be that the Torah is coming to equate the expulsion, right? Expulsion for a Balkari and expulsion for Maga Sheretz are going to be the same. To which the Gemara says, lo, the olum l'tumasam. No, it's coming to equate them for the duration of their tumah. V'hakamash malon de Balkari kemaga sheretz. So we'll say, so remember again, why do I need a comparison? To compare their durations of tumah, the durations are stated explicitly, right? Both convey tumah until the evening. So ultimately, the Gemara says, no, it's coming to teach us the following halacha, that a Balkari is like maga sheretz. How so? Ma maga sheretz b'tami ba'ones. I will say, just like if you come in contact with a sheretz, even ba'ones. I will say, what we mean ba'ones is, let's say, for example, like Rashi said, a dead sheretz falls on you. So if a dead sheretz falls on you, you become tameh. Even though, of course, that's totally ba'ones, extenuating circumstances. Af balkari metami ba'ones. So too, if a man has a seminal emission ba'ones, ultimately, again, he is chayiv, not chayiv, but he becomes tamir as well. For example, Rashi says over here, that's Rashi daf metami ba'ones, kigonim ra'a machmas rov machol umishta. So we'll say it's very interesting that sometimes Chazal understood that a man could experience a seminal emission through too much eating and drinking. So even if a person has a seminal emission, let's say not through a normal willful way, but rather through too much food and too much drink, you are tameh for that as well. In other words, I would have thought that maybe the only time a man becomes tameh for seminal emission is if it's we'll call it a willful emission. Kamash Malon know that Tumas Keri is just like Tumas Sheretz, and just like Tumas Sheretz ultimately is metame ba'onis, so too Tumas Keri is metame ba'onis as well. Good. Top of Samiches. Says the Gemara, top of Samiches. So Bo'al Nida Tame Meis. Ultimately, again, if a man has relations with a woman who's a Nida, he becomes Tame like the same level as Tumas Meis. So the Gemara says, Lamai. What does that mean? When the Gemara is trying to equate the Tumah of a man who has relations with a Nida to a person who comes in contact with a corpse, what halach are you trying to highlight? Lemai, ilema lutumasam. If you want to say that they have the same duration of tumah, that's not true. So the Gemara says, "Hai tumas shivak sivbei, v'hai tumas." I'm sorry, not that it's not true. It's already explicitly stated. Hai tumas shivak sivbei, v'hai tumas shivak sivbei. We'll say the Torah explicitly says that if a person comes in contact with a corpse, the duration of tumah is 7 days. A man has relations with a woman who's in nida, the duration of the tumah is 7 days. Ella lav lemachanosam. Rather, it must be for expulsion purposes. That halacha lemaisa, so a man who has relations with a woman who's in nida has the same level or same degree of expulsion from the camp as tumas meis. Now remember, again, we've already seen for tamei meis, what's the expulsion halacha? Where are you expelled from for tumas meis? Only Machane Shechina. It's very interesting, actually, right? It's only that you can't go into the Beis HaMikdash. But remember, again, you could go into the Harabayis. You go into the Harabayis, you just can't go into the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara is suggesting that the same way that Tumas Meis is expelled from Machane Shechina, so maybe Baal Nida is also expelled from Machane Shechina. Umei the Sefer LeMachanosam, but if the end of the Brisa is talking about expulsion, the Gemara says, Reisha Nami Lemachanosam. So then the first part of the Brisa, which we just were discussing before with Balkari and Tumas Sheretz, should also be talking about expulsion. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. Midei Irya, Hakadisa, V'Hakadisa. Maybe not, and it could very well be that each part of the Brisa is reckoned separately. So Meisvei, Mitzorah Chamar Mizav, V'Zav Chamar Mitame Meis. So we'll say now the Brisa says as follows, Mitzorah, the Tumas Mitzorah is more chamer, is stricter than the Tumah of Zav. And Zav is more chamer than Tumas Meis. Yatsa Balkeri, Shetame Meis Chamura Mimenu. But yet, Tumas Meis is more chamer than Balkari. Shabbos says, so now what does this mean when it says, so first of all, the first part I already knew from yesterday. Right? We already knew this. That in terms from an expulsion perspective, so Metzora is the most chamer, because remember again, Metzora is sent out of all three machanos. Machane Shechina, Machane Levia, Machane Yisrael. Zav is sent out of two machanos, Machane Shechina, Machane Levia, and Tumas Meis is only expelled from Machane Shechina itself. Machane Shechina, which I will say, by the way, you understand the great anomaly in that, right? Like a corpse is referred to as Avi Avos Hatuma, right? Avi Avos Hatuma. It's the highest level of Tuma. Yet, interestingly enough, the expulsion for exposure to that Tuma is the most lenient one. It's very interesting. I think, by the way, there's a simple idea with it. I think it's because of the idea that almost everyone contracts Tumas Meis at some point in time. Right, you have a loved one who dies. You have something. I don't know that it's the most common form of tumah, but lamaisa, it's a life cycle form of tumah. So if you expel people from all three machanos because of life cycle tumah, that's just going to create. I think it just creates an incredible hardship. Anyway, the Gemara says as follows: V'zav charmi tamas meis yotza balkari shetami meis charmeno. But balkari is excluded, or literally again, balkari is excluded, or balkari stands out. Ultimately, again, because Tumas Meis is more chamer. The Gemara says, what does that phrase mean? My yatsa. What does that mean, yatsa? That Balkari went out. Lav yatsa michlal zov ubal lechlal tame meis. Does it not mean, Avosei? See, here's what's interesting. When you look at Balkari, and you look where to place the Balkari, in which category, it makes the most sense to put him with who? With who? A zav. Right? Because we'll say, remember again, what's common denominator between a Balkari and a Zav? They're both emissions. So when looking from a Tumah perspective and so from an expulsion perspective, so I would have thought that Balkari falls into the category of Zav. Yet maybe what the Bryce is saying is like this: Yotza Balkari shetame meis chamor imenu. So my mat Yotza lav Yotza michlal Zav ubal lichlal tame meis. Does it not mean that we take the Balkari out of the category of Zav, which is the category we would have normally put him in, and ultimately, again, we put him in the category of Tumas Meis, Daha Tame Meis Chamor Mimenu, Umutter B'machane Levia. Because ultimately, again, Tame Meis will be more Chamor than Zav, and ultimately, again, is mutter to come into Machane Levia, to which the Gemara said, Lo, Yotza Mi Machane Tame Meis, V'nichnas L'machane Zav. No, so what it means is just the opposite. It means that we are going to remove Balkari from the category of Tumas Meis and put Balkari into the expulsion halachas for Zav. The Afagav, the Tame Meis Chamer Mimenu, and ultimately again, even though Tame Meis is more Chamer than Tumas Balkari, which I will say on a very simple level is why. Remember, Tumas Meis is a 7-day duration of Tumah. Tumas Kari is how long? 1 day. Well, at most, I don't even mean a whole day. It's until the evening of that particular emission. And even though Tamei Meis is more chamer than it, nevertheless, the mutter machana levia. So ultimately, again, it'll be mutter machana levia. So lemai didami leimidamin alei. Ultimately, again, for whatever, so we'll say, what we're going to say is, even though halacha lemaisa, you can make the argument that Tumas Meis ultimately is going to be more chamer than Zav, which makes sense, but ultimately in whatever way we can compare it, we compare it. And therefore, since Zav will be an emission, since Kari is like an emission like Zav, so the Gemara's perspective of it makes more sense to put Kari in the category of Zav than it does to put it in the category of Tumas Meis. Good. So Tani Tana Kamed Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abdimi. V'yatsa al michutz lamachana. The pasuk says he will go out of the camp. I will say now this again. This is talking about a Balkari, right? The pasuk that the Gemara is referring to over here is Kieh b'cha ish asher lo yiyatar mikra layla v'yatsa al michutz lamachana lo yavo el toch hamachana. A person has a seminal emission, what the Torah calls mikra layla, right? An event that occurs at night. Ultimately, again, he goes out of the camp. So the Gemara says, now, interestingly enough, the pasuk is a bit redundant. It says, "V'yatsa al michutz lamachana, lo yavo el toch hamachana." He will go out of the camp. He should not come into the camp. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, "V'yatsa al michutz lamachana, zu machana shchina." This refers, he has to go out of the camp. This refers to machana shchina, which I will say again, for our purposes, means the Beis Hamikdash. Lo yavo al toch hamachana. He should not come into the camp. What does that refer to? Zu Machane Levia. This refers ultimately again to Machane Levia, the Harabayas. Mikan Balkari Sheyatza Chutz Lishtei Machanos. So we'll say from here, what do you see? That Balkari goes out of two camps. Machane Shechina, Machane Levia. We'll say exactly like who? Zav. Right? Exactly like Zav. Just like really what we said before. Right? Zav also goes out of two Machanos. Amarle. Akati lo alaise afikse. He hasn't even, right? The Gemara says you haven't even proven that he could go into one of these camps. You've already removed him. Lishnachrina, another possibility, another version. Akati lo afikse alise. Ela ema michutz lamachane. I'd rather say as follows: michutz lamachane zu machane levia. Maybe michutz lamachane ultimately again means machane levia. Lo yavo tocha machane zu machane shchina, and he shall not go into the camp. And I was about to say the Gemara was just bothered by the order in which they went ahead and explained those phrases. In other words, the pasuk says, "V'yatzal michutz lamachane," he'll go out. Zu machane shchina. Lo yavo, he shouldn't go in. Zu machane levia. So the Gemara just says, perhaps we should just we're not arguing on the fact, but maybe just change around the order of the drashas. Ela ima michutz lamachane, v'yatzal michutz lamachane. What does that refer to? Zu machane levia. Because we will say bepashtos. Remember again, that refers to the harabayis. Right? That refers to Harabayis, Machane Levia. Lo yavo tocha machane, he should not come into the camp, zu machane shchina. This refers to machane shchina. So we'll say, so where the Gemara is holding right now is that Balkari, like Zav, is going to be excluded from two camps. From machane shchina, machane Levia. So the Gemara says, Maskif la Ravina, Ema idi v'idil machane shchina, v'la'avor alav ba'aseh v'la'osaseh. What's an interesting point? So comes along Ravina. Ravina says, well, maybe not. Maybe both phrases are referring to Machane Shechina and telling us that a Balkari is not permitted to go into Machane Shechina. So why does it have to say it twice? To make you in violation of a lo saseh and an aseh if a Balkari does in fact go into Machane Shechina. So the Gemara says, Im kain le makra v'yatsa al michutz lamachane v'lo yavo atocha machane lamali shmamina litin lo machane acheres. So we'll say again, if that's the case, the Gemara says, Pasuk could have just said v'yatsa al michutz lamachane. That's all it needed to say. You shall go out of the camp. Why do I need the second phrase as well? To teach me ultimately again that the Balkari must go ahead and leave a second camp. They will say that the Balkari must leave both Machane Shechina, Machane Levia. So we'll say what the Gemara essentially is suggesting over here, what the Gemara is concluding is that Halacha L'maisa Balkari leaves both camps like the Zav. So therefore I will say, again, if we have time, I'll loop back to the Rambam at the end, because it is an actually interesting Rambam in Hilchos Bias HaMikdash, where the Rambam discusses the concept of Shiluach, the concept of expulsion. But what we have over here is as follows. Tumas Meis, expelled from Machane Shechina. So this, as I mentioned yesterday, is very interesting because again it does allow, again leaving aside any other, but from a Torah perspective, the ability to go up to Harabayis even contemporarily when one is Tamei Tumas Meis. Tumas Meis is only expelled from the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Tumas Zav, and now it appears Balkari as well, is expelled from Machane Shechina and Machane Levia, which again, using just the Yerushalayim model, so therefore the Zav Balkari can't go into the Beis HaMikdash, can't go on Harabayis, but can be within the city of the walls of Yerushalayim. Most stringently, the Mitzorah. The Mitzorah is excluded from Machane Shechina, the Beis HaMikdash, Machane Levia, the Harabayis, and Machane Yisrael, which means that the Mitzorah cannot dwell within the confines of the walls of any Jewish city. So, for example, again, he would have to go outside of the walls of Yerushalayim. So, just an interesting, just basic framework of Torah. Good. Back to the Mishnah. Michui Kravav. So, remember again the Mishnah, when speaking about the things, the aspects of the Karban Pesach that you are permitted to go ahead and perform on Shabbos. So one of the things that the Mishnah said you're allowed to do is Michui Kravav. You could go ahead, now Michui Kravav literally sounds like, well, we'll see what it means, but something with the intestines of the animal. So it says the Gemara, my Michui Kravav, Rav Huna Amar, Shemenakvin B'sakin. Rav Huna says what it means is you perforate the intestines with a knife. What that allows you to do is to squeeze out any waste that may be lodged in the intestines. Reb Chia bar Rav Amar, sirka demaya. It literally means a scraping of the intestines. Then apparently Rashi points out, there's some, Rashi says, Leicha ha'aduka b'me'ayim, sheyotze mehen b'docha kasakin. Apparently there's some type of, I don't know what the right technical term is, schmutz, that is inside of the intestines, that can only be, it's really like stuck there, that has to be removed with the scraping of a knife. So the Gemara says, Sirka demaya denafka agav duchka de sakina. And the only way to remove this schmutz is to go ahead and scrape it off with a knife. Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, my taima de Chia barav. Why does Chia barav, why does he hold that ultimately, again, Michui means the scraping off of this schmutz. The Chsiv will say, interestingly enough, because he quotes a pasuk from Yeshaya. Now, the pasuk in its entirety reads as follows: V'rou kivasim kid davram, and the sheep will graze as it is stated. V'charvos mechim garim yochelu, and literally again, we'll say charvos means the ruins of homes. Mechim, ultimately again, the fat ones. Garim, who sojourn there, will eat it. Now, we'll say, we'll see this in just a moment with the Gemara, but understand the pasuk over here, Yeshayahu, is referring to the fact that when Mashiach comes, the sheep, which is a reference ultimately again to Klal Yisrael, will go ahead and be able to graze on the ruins of the homes who were there before them, which is a reference to the idea that in Eretz Yisrael, that which belonged to our Gentile oppressors over the ages will become the dominion of the Jews in the Messianic era. So the Gemara says, v'charvos. Now we'll say, interestingly enough, so we're going to see, mechim. So the Gemara is picking up on the fact, remember, the Mishnah called it michui kravim, right? And now Rechia Barav is saying michui means the scraping. The Navi uses the same lashon of mechim over here. So my mashma kid b'tagin Rav Yosef v'nechseim dereshia tzadikim yachasun. It means that the property of the wicked, the tzadikim will go ahead and consume. V'ro kevasim kidabram. So now once the Gemara quoted this, the Gemara kind of goes on with the drush over here. V'ro kevasim kidabram, and the sheep will graze as it is said. Amrav Menashe bar Yirmiyah Amrav kimedubar bam, as it is stated by them. My kimedubar bam Amrav Baye v'charvos mechim garim yochelu. What is stated by the sheep? That the sheep will eat the ruins of that the fat ones sojourned in. Amrali Rava bishlama iksiv charvos kid ka'amrit. Hashta dichsiv v'charavos milsachri sikamar. That would be fine if it said charvos. But now it says vicharvos, which sounds like the Navi is coming to imply something else. Ela Amar Rava kitrav Chananel Amar Rav. Both is very beautiful. Don't have Chananel Amar Rav. Asidin tzadikim sheyichyu hamesim. Both say, now interestingly enough, we're going to be referring to over here both the Messianic era as well as what we call Olam Haba. In the future, which Rabbi say the Pashtus means after the coming of Mashiach, that tzaddikim will be mechayim mesim. Tzaddikim will have the ability to go ahead and revive the dead. Revive the dead. So the Gemara says, Ksiv hacha, it says over here, Uru'u kivasim kidabram, that the sheep will graze as it is stated. Ksiv hasam, Yiru bashan v'gilad kime olam. Bashan ze Elisha. So Bashan ultimately again refers to Elisha. Haba min Bashan shene'emar vaye'ani v'shafat bebashan uksiv po Elisha ben Shafat asher yatzak mayin ayidei Eliyahu. Gilad ze Eliyahu. So Gilad refers to Eliyahu. Shene'emar vayomer Eliyahu atishbi mitoshvei Gilad. So we'll say ultimately again through these various psukim and similar words in each of these psukim, the Gemara comes to the conclusion that in the Messianic era, Asad Lavo, tzaddikim will have the ability to perform tchias hamesim. They will have the ability to resurrect the dead. Amar Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani. So we'll say second wide line. Rav Yonasan. Asidim tzaddikim sheyichyu mesim. In the future, the tzaddikim will have the ability to revive the dead. Shene'emar. Both is actually quite beautiful. Od yeshvu zekenim uzekinas berechovos Yerushalayim. In the future. So remember again, this is the beautiful vision of the Navi Zechariah. That when Mashiach comes, what's going to happen? The old men and the old women will sit in the streets of Yerushalayim. V'ish mishanto biado merov yamim. And every person will have his staff in his hands from literally, again, longevity of days. So we'll say, now remember, interestingly enough, what's bothering the Gemara, Rashi points out over here, Rashi points out over here is that halacha lamaisa, if you're sitting down, why do you need a staff in your hands? Right? In other words, a staff is only necessary if you're walking, but if you're sitting, why do you need a staff? To which the Gemara understands because the staff represents something else. What does it represent? Uksiv v'samta mishanti apnei hanar. By Elisha Hanavi, right? When Elisha wanted to revive the Isha Shunamis, the boy who had passed away, he told Gehazi, go ahead and take my staff and put it on the boy. So again, that doesn't end up happening. Elisha ends up reviving the boy himself. But Lamaisa, the staff was a reference to Elisha's ability to bring back the dead. So the Gemara suggests over here that in the Yemos HaMashiach, the Zekinim and the Zekinos, which represent the righteous people, will sit with their staff in their hand. Now, because they're sitting, the staff can't be a reference to a staff needed in order to support oneself when walking. So therefore, the Gemara understands that the staff is a reference to the ability to perform Tchias HaMesim. We'll say it's actually really, really quite amazing. Again, there's what to discuss in this idea that what does it mean in Yemos HaMashiach, the tzaddikim are going to have the ability to perform Tchias HaMesim. So we'll say, so remember again, think about, what is Tchias HaMesim? Tchias HaMesim is, if we think about it, is like the one miracle, right? Mechayim Mesim Ata Rav Lahoshia. Tchias HaMesim is the miracle most associated with the Ribono Shel Olam. As the Gemara says, it's the Mafteach Shel Chaya, it's the key of life, which the Ribono Shel Olam holds. The Gemara, one of the three Maftechos, one of the three keys. So we'll say, the idea being that when Mashiach comes, the Yemos HaMashiach, there's going to be such a clarity regarding the Ribono Shel Olam. So again, because the Mefarshim discuss, is this literal, that the tzaddikim will have the ability to perform Tchias HaMesim, or perhaps it means that there'll be such an acute level of God awareness and understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and acceptance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that it's as if the tzaddikim will have the ability to perform Tchias HaMesim. Tchias HaMesim, which is like the hallmark or the cornerstone miracle that makes HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even the tzaddikim will have an understanding of Tchias HaMesim. Whether they will be able to perform it or not is a different discussion, but it represents a heightened level of God awareness, of divine clarity. Ula Ramiksiv, so Ula contrast Pesukim, it says, Bila Hamavas Anatzach, it says death will be swallowed up forever. Uksiv ki hanar ben mea shana. And it says also that ultimately the boy is 100, ki hanar ben mea shana yamos. The young man will be at least 100 years old before he dies. So both sides. So two conflicting psukim. Because bila hamavas lanatzach means what? Means that death will be swallowed up forever. But then the Navi also says that what? Pretty much no one will ever die before 100. Which means there'll be longevity. So which one is it? Is there longevity, or ultimately again, is there no more death? To which the Gemara says, Lokashya, kan bi Yisrael, kan ba'akum. One is referring to a Jew, and one is referring to an akum. So apparently, again, in the Yemos HaMashiach, maybe death will be swallowed up forever. But ultimately, again, the akum, it could be again that the Gentile will still experience death, but even the Messianic era will still be blessed with longevity. So the Gemara says, Ovdei Kochavim mai ba'u hasam. But what part do the Ovdei Kochavim have in Yemos HaMashiach? So this is actually pretty incredible. Dichsiv va'amdu zarim v'ra'ot zonachem u'bnei eichar akirim v'karmechem. Also, to which the Navi says that in the Messianic era, the Yeshaya says, we'll say, remember, all of this is embedded in a much bigger machlokes concerning the Messianic era. Right? What exactly is Yemos HaMashiach like? So here, obviously, the Gemara is taking the perspective that the Messianic era is much more miraculous in nature. So we will be occupied with spiritual pursuits. That's very nice. Who's taking care of the sheep? Who's taking care of the household, right? Who's managing my brokerage account, right? So the Gemara says, Navi says, don't worry about it. That in Yirtzeh Hashem, the Gentile nations will step up, and they will be there ultimately again to handle our financial affairs. Now, of course, just for this, so you should always understand that there is another point of view on the Messianic era. And the other point of view of the Messianic era is Olam Kimin Hago Noheg. It'll be a regular world. It's the same world when Mashiach comes, with a couple of major distinctions. Number one, humanity recognizes HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I will say, that's pretty major. Can you imagine what the world looked like if everyone recognized the Ribono Shel Olam? Now, that doesn't mean everybody becomes Jewish, but everybody recognizes Rimon Shalom. So I'm just pointing out, you see these two dramatic different approaches as to what Yemos HaMashiach looks like. A supernatural time where there's no death for the Jew, longevity for the Gentile. The Jew is totally occupied with spiritual pursuits, and the Gentile nations see to our material needs. Versus a world in which Olam Kimin Hago Noeg, regular world, just a profound theological shift and God awareness on the part of all of humanity. And of course, number two, a recognition ultimately again of Am Yisrael's connection and right to Eretz Yisrael. So both things which are pretty dramatic and amazing in of themselves. So the Gemara goes back to Rav Chisda Miksiv. Rav Chisda contrasts the two psukim. It says v'chafra levana busha chama. It says ultimately again, literally the levana, the moon will be covered and the sun will be embarrassed. Which I both say sounds like that in the future the sun and the moon will not shine. Uksiv v'haya arha levana ka'ara chama v'ara yeshivasayim kar shivasayim yamim. But then the next pasuk says that the light of the moon will be like the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be 70 times stronger than what it is now. So we'll say, so which one is it? In the future, are the luminaries here or they're not here? So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, kan the olam haba, kan the Yemos HaMashiach. So also it's very interesting. So the Gemara says, it's two different times. In Olam Haba, which I will say we assume ultimately again is the place where you go when you die, there is no sun and moon there. Because there you bask in the light of the Ribono Shel Olam. And the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, eclipses the light of the luminaries. When the Navi discusses the amplification of the light of the luminaries, that's talking about the Messianic era. In the Messianic era, the moon becomes quote-unquote whole, and the sun becomes even stronger. So the Gemara says, "L'shmuel damar." Here we go. L'shmuel damar ein ben olam hazeh l'mos Mashiach elo shibur malchus bilvad. Ma'ikal meimer. But I will say, here it is. As I mentioned before, according to Shmuel. Remember, Shmuel is the opinion who holds. I will say that in the Messianic era, there's no great dramatic miracles. I mean, there are miracles. There's no subjugation by the nations of the world. Everybody recognizes God. Eretz Yisrael belongs to us, and no one contests that right. But according to Shmuel, the sun's going to be the sun, the moon's going to be the moon. So how do you understand this pasuk? So the Gemara says, both are referring to Olam Haba, where you go when you die. Velo kasha, haba machane shchina, haba machane tzadikim. And I will say again, amazingly enough, in Olam Haba there are also different places. So if you're in what's called machane shchina, which is you have the privilege to bask directly in the glory of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there you bask in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light. There's no luminary light. There's only HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light. But if you're in Machane Tzadikim, which by the way sounds like a great place to be in also for all eternity. If you're in Machane Tzadikim, so apparently there is light, but ultimately again there, the Tzadikim have the benefit of an amplified luminary, an amplified moon, and an amplified sun. Quite beautiful. I'll say obviously there's so much to speak about all of these things, but we have to get to Amud Beis. Rava Ramiksiv, Ani Amis Va'achya. So the pasuk says, I am God, who literally again, Amis means I put to death and I bring to life. Uksiv machatzti va'ani arpa. And it says, I will make ill and I will heal. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand. Hashta chuyi mechaye marpela kol shekin. Why does the pasuk, if God is the one who goes out and gives life, right? If he goes ahead and gives life, then why does it have to say he heals? Obviously, I will say, Kadosh Baruch Hu could give life. Of course, he could heal. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? The Rosh Hashanah says like this: Ma shani memis ani mechayev kimo shabachatli ani erpa. What's coming teaching is like this: just like I heal that which I made sick, so too I will give life to that which I took life from. In other words, what the pasuk over here is referring to is what? Tchias hamesim, the resurrection of the dead. It's not just simply meaning, if we would have just said, Kadosh Baruch Hu gives life, so gives life, okay, the baby that's born, he gives life, seems something more. Just like I heal that which I made sick, which is the same person, so too I will give life to whom I took life from. So the Gemara says, so I will go ahead, I took life and I will give life. Yochol misa ve'echad v'chaim ve'echad k'derech sha'olam noeg. You might have thought that it's referring to two different people. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, some people I take life from, some people I give life to. Therefore the pasuk says, I gave sickness and therefore I will heal. Just like the sickness, the illness, and the healing is in one person. Af misa b'chaim be'echad. So too HaKadosh Baruch Hu is talking about over here that I took life and I will give life is referring to the same person. But say ultimately again, here is a refutation for those who say there is no scriptural allusion ultimately again to Tchias HaMesim, to resurrection of the dead. So therefore, it is this pasuk in Devarim that is a biblical reference to resurrection, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ani amis ve'echya, is referring to the same person. He whom I took life from will be the very person whom I give life back to. So the Gemara says, Tavar Achar, Betchila mashani mamis ani mechaye, v'chad v'hadar mashamachatsti vani erpe. So ultimately, again, it could also be a HaKadosh Baruch Hu Tchias HaMesim over here, and he says, first, I will give life to whom I took life from, and then I will heal he who is sick. Also, what that means is as follows. Rashi points out that Tchias HaMesim takes on two parts. The first thing HaKadosh Baruch Hu do is he's going to bring the dead back to life. That's one. But then the second part, Rabbi say, is that it could very well be that when people died, they had certain ailments. So then the next part will be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will what? Will heal the ailments of those individuals. I will say quite amazing. In general, one of the interesting questions that we think about is when there's Tchias HaMesim, right? What's like the question that's on your mind, right? What age do you come back with, right? I don't want to come back with a walker with tennis balls on it, right? That's not what I want, right? I'd like to come back a little, but when do you come back? How do you come back? Do you come back when you're 80? You come back when you're 30? You come back when you're 15 years old? And then what does that mean? Do you age after that, or do I not age after? It's obviously good kashas. Halavai Mirat Hashem will be zoche to see bekarov. But here's what we do know. It sounds like from here that when there's Tchias HaMesim, there's some type of resurrection with your pre-existing conditions, right? So that's what it sounds like. So I'm resurrected. If you look at Rashi says, "Shekiderech shehem mesim chigrim sumim ilmim kachein chayim." So we'll say it sounds like from here that I'm resurrected in the same way in which I died. So in which case I'm resurrected as I was at the moment of death. But here's the difference: whatever ailments I had, HaKadosh Baruch Hu then goes back and heals. So we'll say this is interesting. So what does this mean? The world is going to be like one big senior citizen community. It's going to be like we're all living in Boca. Like what was it? Like what's no. I think Jeff Rosenblum is on here. I didn't mean to make any Boca jokes or Dore Beach jokes. Good. So I'll say so interesting enough. So what does that mean? Again, obviously we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens when Mashiach comes. But again, it is interesting to see resurrection is in two parts. First, the dead are brought back to life, and then ultimately, again, the living are healed from their ailments. Good. Amid days, we'll say. Amid days. Good. I'm making good time here today. Hector Chalavov. I'll say, so the next part is, so the other thing you're allowed to do in the Beis HaMikdash or Korban Pesach is you are allowed to go ahead and burn the fats on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara says, Tanya, Amr B'Shimon, Bo Urei Kama Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. See how important, see how dear a mitzvah in its right time is. Shari Hector Chalavim Ve'ivarim Upedarim. Because also remember again, the burning of the fats and sacrificial parts on the Mizbeach, Ksherim Kol HaLayla. Ultimately, again, you could do it all night. Ve'in mamtinin lahen ad shetechshach. But I will say, interestingly enough, we actually don't wait until nightfall. So even though you could go ahead and burn the fats and the limbs all night long, chaviva mitzvah b'shaita. How praiseworthy it is to do a mitzvah at a point in time, which is another way of saying zrizin makdimin lemitzvahs. That also when it comes to performance of mitzvahs, we don't wait, we don't delay. You chatof yachol, you grab your opportunities as they come. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, hakavasa v'hava also. So we'll say, so remember again, the next thing the Mishnah said, then went into the list of things you're not allowed to do to the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. So for example, you can't carry the Pesach from outside the Tchum, or you can't carry the Pesach without an Erev, even when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos. The other thing the Gemara discussed was cutting off a wart. If the animal has a wart, and the presence of the wart would preclude you from offering up the animal, you can't cut off the wart on Shabbos. On Shabbos Erev Pesach. So the Gemara says, or minhu, but 1 second, we learned, we learned that in fact you are allowed to go ahead and cut off a wart on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside the Beis HaMikdash. Now both say, let's understand, what's involved in cutting off a wart? What's wrong with cutting off a wart? So with Pashtos, this is a derivative of the malacha of gozes. Right? The malacha of gozes is shearing. You're not allowed to shear an animal on Shabbos. So b'pashtos, the wart removal ultimately again would be a derivative of that. Yet the Bryce over here says you can remove a wart on Shabbos inside of the Beis Hamikdash from the animal, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Ve'im bekli, but if you remove the wart with a utensil, kan v'kan aser, then it's aser in the Mikdash and outside of the Mikdash. So we'll say, but yet our Mishnah said you can't remove the wart, so what's going on? So again, I will say, how do we reconcile our Mishnah that says you can't remove the wart with the Bryce that says you can remove the wart? So two different opinions. So we'll say one opinion said both are dealing with wart removal by hand, and it's not a contradiction. One is talking about a moist wart, one is talking about a dry wart. So we'll say, so what does this mean? That remember, the dry wart, as we're going to see, pretty much crumbles when you remove it. That's when it's not a problem to remove that on Shabbos. So the Brisa that says that you could remove a wart was talking about a dried out wart that can be very easily removed by hand. A moist wart is much more complicated, and that'll be asur on Shabbos. The Gemara says, I'm sorry. The other opinion said no. Both are dealing with a moist wart. One is talking about wart removal by hand, and one is talking about wart removal with a utensil. You cannot remove a wart with a utensil on Shabbos, either in the Beis Hamikdash or outside of the Beis Hamikdash. But in the Brisa said that you can remove a wart inside the Beis Hamikdash. That's if you're able to pull it off somehow with your hand. As long as you don't have to use the kli, it's going to work. And remember again, removing a wart with your hand outside of the Beis Hamikdash will be an Isser D'Rabbanan. But remember, inside the Beis Hamikdash we have a concept of Ein Shavus B'Mikdash. Right? That Dinei D'Rabbanan, right, rabbinic law, when it interferes with sacrificial law, is kind of set aside. So the Gemara says, L'man damar ha biyad v'ha b'kli, according to the opinion who made the distinction, that the Brisa is talking about wart removal by hand, and the Mishnah is talking about by a kli. Why didn't he subscribe to the approach that said both are talking about wart removal by hand? And make the distinction that our Mishnah, which did not allow the removal of wart, was talking about a moist wart. The Brisa that said that you can remove the wart is talking about a dry wart. Dry wart. So Amar Lecha Yevesha Mifrach Pricha, because he'll say the removal of a dry wart is not a question. Why? Because apparently once the wart dries out, it just crumbles. And everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa, that is not problematic. U'leman da'amar idi v'idi biyad v'lo kasha. And according to the approach who said that both the Mishnah and the Brisa are talking about the removal by hand, and it's not a contradiction. One is talking about a dry wart, one is talking about a moist wart. V'lo kasha. I'm sorry. My time, why didn't he go with the approach that said idi v'idi b'lacha? But they're talking about a moist word. V'lo kasha habiyad habekli. Amar lecha, he'll say to you, I'm sorry. Amar lecha kli. Amar lecha kli hakatani hasam im bekli kan v'kan aser. Because he will say that no. Everyone will agree you can't use the kli, because once there's the usage of a kli, by definition it becomes aser. V'idach hadiktani kli hacha plugta Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua aslashmin. And the other opinion will say no. The reason it brought down the discussion regarding the kli is to introduce the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. So good. So we'll say so halacha lamaisa. The way the Rambam codifies this halacha is by making the distinction between the moist wort and the dried one. That halacha lamaisa. I'm sorry, that they're both talking about let me take it differently. The Rambam paskins that the removal of a dry wart is not going to be a problem, because generally it just crumbles and there's no din of gozes, there's no potential issue of shearing. The moist wart issue, it depends how you're removing it. If you're removing it biyad, if you're removing it by hand, then that will be mutter inside of the Beis HaMikdash, prohibited outside of the Beis HaMikdash. But removal of the moist wort with a kli will be problematic ultimately again in the mikdash and outside of the mikdash. Good. Rabbi Eliezer, umayim shchita. So remember again, the Mishnah then got into a more general discussion. Rabbi Eliezer said that halacha l'maisa. Rabbi Eliezer wanted to make a kal v'chomer, and he felt that the removal of the wort from the korban Pesach should be mutter on Shabbos based on a kal v'chomer. What was the kal v'chomer? If you're allowed to do shchita. If you're allowed to do shchita on Shabbos for the korban Pesach, which is an Isser D'Oraisa, then certainly what? You could remove the wort, which is at most what? An Isser D'Rabbanan. That was Rabbi Eliezer's logic. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rabbi Eliezer, so Rabbi Yoshua, and remember, Rabbi Yoshua came along, and Rabbi Yoshua disagreed with this. Rabbi Yoshua said Rabbi Yeshua said, Yom Tov Yochiach. Also, we're going to get to a fascinating sugi now in the last 2 minutes we have. Rabbi Yeshua said, that's not a good argument. I'll tell you why. Look at Yom Tov. Yom Tov, right? Yom Tov, you are allowed to do malacha, right? You're allowed to do malacha for the sake of ochel nefesh, and yet rabbinic law still remains. Also, remember again, let me go back 1 second. Rabbi Eliezer, the Mishnah said that you can't remove the wart from the Karban Pesach on Shabbos. Although there's a lot of stuff you could do vis-a-vis the Pesach, you can't remove the wart. Rabbi Eliezer says that makes no sense. If you're allowed to go ahead and do shchita, which is an Isser D'Oraisa, you could certainly remove the wart, which is at most an Isser D'Rabbanan. To which Rabbi Yeshua said, I'll tell you why your logic is flawed. Look at Yom Tiv. Yom Tiv, you're allowed to do things which are normally an Isser D'Oraisa. What can you do on Yom Tiv? You could cook, you could do Ochel Nefesh. Yet, rabbinic prohibitions still remain intact. So you see from here that just because certain biblical prohibitions are lifted does not automatically mean that rabbinic prohibitions are lifted as well. That's Rabbi Yeshua's logic. Rabbi Yeshua l'tamei, Rabbi Yeshua goes according to his reasoning. Because what does Rabbi Yeshua say? The Amar, we'll say this is great. Simchas Yom Tov nami mitzvahi. Rabbi Yeshua says that the obligation to rejoice on Yom Tov is a biblical obligation. This Sanya, we'll say, here we go, this is great. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, we'll say this is an incredible Gemara, which we'll start today, and I think what we'll probably just do is maybe we'll start a little bit earlier tomorrow. Rabbi Eliezer says like this. Rabbi Eliezer says, on Yom Tiv, you have to make a choice. Do you want your Yom Tiv experience to be holy, or do you want it to be mundane? Either you're going to eat and drink, or you're going to sit and learn. I will say, so we'll have to explore exactly what this means. That Rabbi Eliezer is saying is Yom Tov is an all or nothing experience. Either it's not mundane, because even the eating and drinking is holy, but either you make it a more physical experience, or you make it a spiritual experience. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Chalkir. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you split the day in half. Chalkeu, Chatzev la'achil l'shtia, Chatzev l'beis hamedrash, Yom Tov must be split in half. Half of it, ultimately, again, is for spiritual pursuits. Half of it, ultimately, again, is for material pursuits, or not material pursuits, physical enjoyment. From Rabbi Yochanan, Ushneim mikra echad darsha. Rabbi Yochanan said they both darsha in the same pasuk. Kasav echad omer atzeres la'Hashem elokecha. One pasuk, as I both say now, atzeres, we're going to see, means as follows. It says, Sheishes yomim tocha matzos, ubiyom hashi atzeres la'Hashem elokecha. So it's talking about if you're a Pesach, but we're going to see it refers to Yom Tov V'Jan. We'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Amiras Hashem with this. We're going to start the daf tomorrow morning at 5:45. Well, we'll resume Tzidik Chasad and Amiras Hashem next week. We'll say tomorrow morning, incredible sugya about Simchas Yom Tov, and just in general about an incredible Hashkafas HaChaim. So we'll continue over here tomorrow. We'll say.